The first thing Donald Trump noticed about Manhattan was the noise. Not the traffic, not the sirens, not even the constant growl of construction echoing through the avenues. It was the noise of ambition. In the late 1960s, Manhattan felt like the center of the universe. Steel rose from the ground like monuments to ego. Men in expensive suits moved through marble lobbies carrying briefcases full of debt, dreams, and danger. Every block smelled like cigarette smoke, hot concrete, and money. And somewhere inside that roaring machine of wealth and status walked a young man from Queens with slicked back hair, a sharp jawline, and a hunger that bordered on obsession. Donald Trump was only in his 20s, but he already carried himself like someone who believed the city belonged to him, not someday, now. He wasn't arriving as an outsider with no connections. His father, Fred Trump, had already built a powerful real estate empire across Brooklyn and Queens. Thousands of apartments, government-backed developments, stable income, reliable cash flow. Fred Trump understood one thing better than almost anyone in New York: housing. He knew how to build it cheaply. He knew how to negotiate construction costs down to the last dollar. He knew how to collect rent with ruthless efficiency. He understood tax abatements, political favors, zoning advantages, and the hidden machinery of urban development. To Fred Trump, real estate wasn't glamorous. It was war. And Donald grew up watching every battle. As a child, Donald followed his father to construction sites instead of playgrounds. He watched men pour foundations while Fred negotiated contracts in heavy overcoats beside piles of mud and steel beams. Fred wasn't emotional. He wasn't warm in the cinematic fatherly sense. He was disciplined, demanding, cold when necessary. To him, weakness was expensive. Donald learned early that respect didn't come from kindness. It came from dominance. At the dinner table, conversations revolved around deals, tenants, money, and leverage. Fred talked about politicians, the way military generals discuss territory. Buildings weren't buildings, they were assets, weapons, sources of control. Donald absorbed everything. And yet, even as a teenager, he already wanted something different. Queens made money. Manhattan made legends. That distinction consumed him. By the time Donald attended military school, the competitive instinct inside him had sharpened into something relentless. The New York Military Academy didn't soften him, it intensified him. Structure, hierarchy, winning. Those ideas became central to his identity. He loved competition because competition created rankings, and rankings created winners. Even then, he hated the idea of being ordinary. Classmates remembered his confidence bordering on theatricality. Donald projected certainty even when he lacked experience. He understood something most people never learn. Perception could become reality. That principle would later become one of the foundations of his fortune. When he entered the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, Donald wasn't dreaming about becoming a quiet businessman managing apartment complexes in outer boroughs. He wanted skylines, headlines, attention. He wanted Manhattan. Back then, New York City was entering one of the darkest periods in its history. Crime exploded. Graffiti covered subway cars. The city nearly went bankrupt. Entire neighborhoods looked abandoned. But Donald Trump saw opportunity where others saw decay. That mindset separated ambitious real estate developers from ordinary investors. When cities collapse, property becomes cheap, and cheap property can create empires. Fred Trump remained cautious. Queens and Brooklyn provided stable returns. Manhattan was volatile, political, dangerous. Donald loved that. He was drawn to risk because risk created visibility, and visibility created power. In the early 1970s, Donald officially joined his father's company. But internally, he was already preparing his escape from the outer borough's shadow. He wanted bigger deals, bigger buildings, bigger headlines. He began spending more time in Manhattan, studying the players who dominated New York real estate: developers, bankers, lawyers, political fixers. He watched how they spoke, how they negotiated, how they dressed. This was not simply business, it was theater. The city rewarded confidence, so Donald amplified his confidence until it became almost mythological. Then came one of the first major turning points of his career: the Commodore Hotel. At the time, the hotel sat near Grand Central Terminal like a dying relic. Dark windows, financial disaster, another collapsing piece of old New York. Most people saw a bad investment. Donald saw a stage. The deal looked nearly impossible. The property was failing. The city was struggling financially. Banks were nervous. But Donald had something more powerful than experience. He had audacity. He began maneuvering through political offices, banking institutions, and corporate negotiations with astonishing aggression for someone his age. This was where he learned one of the most important lessons of his life. In real estate, relationships mattered as much as buildings. He pushed for tax abatements from New York City. He negotiated with the Hyatt hotel chain. He sold the dream before the project even existed. That became another defining Trump strategy. Sell the vision first. Build belief before reality. The transformation of the Commodore into the Grand Hyatt became Donald Trump's arrival moment. Suddenly, newspapers noticed him. Young, bold, aggressive, photogenic. He wasn't just another developer. He looked like a celebrity pretending to be a businessman, or maybe the reverse. And in New York during the late 1970s, image mattered enormously. The city was rebuilding itself psychologically. Wealth was becoming performance art. Donald understood that instinctively. He gave interviews constantly. He called reporters directly, sometimes pretending to be his own publicist under fake names. He fed newspapers stories about his success, not because he needed validation, because publicity increased leverage. The more famous he became, the more powerful he appeared, and the more powerful he appeared, the easier it became to make deals. That cycle would define his career for decades. Soon, Donald Trump's name started appearing across tabloids and business pages throughout New York. But he wasn't satisfied, not even close. Then he found the project that would transform him from wealthy developer into global brand: Trump Tower. Fifth Avenue, one of the most prestigious streets in the world. Luxury jewelry stores, designer boutiques, old money, new ambition, the center of status. Trump wanted his name there, not hidden, displayed, massive, golden. The construction process became pure Trump psychology. He didn't merely want another skyscraper. He wanted a monument to wealth itself. The design featured cascading indoor waterfalls, polished brass, pink marble, mirrored surfaces, dramatic atriums. Every detail screamed luxury. Even the lobby felt designed for cameras. Donald understood visual branding before social media existed. He knew rich environments created emotional reactions. People wanted to feel successful just by walking through the building. And then there was the name, Trump, huge letters, impossible to ignore. Most developers branded companies. Donald branded himself. That decision changed everything. Because once your own name becomes the product, every building increases personal fame. Trump Tower became more than real estate. It became a symbol. Celebrities moved in. Executives, athletes, foreign billionaires. The building attracted cameras like a magnet. Donald loved it. He appeared everywhere. Television interviews, magazine covers, society events, talk shows. He cultivated an image somewhere between businessman, celebrity, and king. And during the roaring excess of the 1980s, America was ready for that character. Wall Street exploded with greed. Luxury consumption became cultural obsession. Gold watches, stretch limousines, private helicopters, power lunches. Trump fit the era perfectly. He spoke in superlatives. Everything was the biggest, the best, the most luxurious. Critics mocked him. The public watched anyway, because Donald Trump understood something fundamental about media. Being underestimated could become an advantage. Attention itself had value, even negative attention, especially negative attention. As his fame increased, so did his appetite for larger and riskier deals. He acquired luxury hotels, airlines, yachts, casinos. The Trump brand expanded like wildfire, and nowhere did his ambitions become more dangerous than Atlantic City. During the 1980s, Atlantic City looked like a gold rush for casino developers. Gambling money poured through the city in rivers of cash. Donald wanted dominance, not participation. He bought casinos aggressively, borrowing enormous amounts of money. Debt became fuel. That was another core Trump philosophy. Use leverage at massive scale. To Donald, debt wasn't necessarily danger. Debt was acceleration. As long as property values rose and revenue continued flowing, leverage created explosive growth. But leverage also magnified collapse, and Donald Trump was about to discover that lesson brutally. The Taj Mahal Casino became the ultimate expression of Trump-style excess. Crystal chandeliers, gold finishes, massive gaming floors, advertising campaigns everywhere. He called it the eighth wonder of the world. The opening felt like a Hollywood premiere mixed with a royal coronation. Celebrities arrived. Television crews swarmed the building. Trump stood beneath blazing lights while photographers screamed his name. For a moment, he looked untouchable. Then the debt started crushing him. The casino industry became oversaturated. Interest payments ballooned. Economic conditions shifted. Suddenly, the empire that looked invincible started cracking, and the cracks spread fast. By the early 1990s, Donald Trump faced catastrophic financial pressure. Billions in debt, banks panicking, projects bleeding cash, headlines predicting collapse. His helicopter companies struggled. The airline failed. Casinos faced bankruptcy. The image of unstoppable success began disintegrating publicly. And for someone who built power through perception, public humiliation became dangerous. The media turned vicious. Newspapers described him as reckless, over-leveraged, finished. His personal life exploded into tabloids simultaneously. The divorce from Ivana Trump dominated headlines. Gossip magazines transformed his marriage into spectacle. Donald Trump understood publicity better than most public figures. But this level of exposure became chaotic. His wealth, his relationships, his ego, his debts, everything became entertainment. And yet, somehow, he survived. That survival revealed one of the most important traits behind his career. Donald Trump rarely accepted defeat psychologically. Even during disaster, he projected confidence. He negotiated relentlessly with banks. He convinced lenders that keeping him alive financially served their interests better than destroying him. This was classic Trump negotiation. Create situations where other people become invested in your survival. The banks faced a terrifying realization. Donald Trump owed so much money that his collapse could hurt them too. That gave him leverage. He restructured debt, sold assets, made compromises privately while projecting strength publicly. The contrast became central to the Trump phenomenon. Behind closed doors, intense financial pressure. In public, absolute confidence. And strangely, that strategy worked. Because perception influences markets. If people believe someone remains powerful, opportunities continue appearing. Throughout the 1990s, Trump rebuilt carefully, not quietly, never quietly, but strategically. He focused increasingly on branding rather than direct ownership. That shift mattered enormously. Owning skyscrapers required huge capital. Licensing a famous name required far less risk. Hotels, condominiums, golf courses, products. The Trump brand itself became monetized. And despite endless criticism, the name still carried psychological weight. Luxury, success, power, or at least the appearance of power. Donald understood that many consumers weren't buying buildings. They were buying association. They wanted proximity to the image. The illusion mattered almost as much as reality. Meanwhile, New York itself transformed again. The gritty financial anxiety of the 1970s gave way to hyper-capitalist spectacle. Times Square became commercialized. Wall Street boomed. Celebrity culture exploded. Television became more aggressive, faster, louder. Trump adapted perfectly. He always understood media instinctively. Short quotes, memorable phrases, conflict, confidence. He treated interviews like negotiations. Even criticism kept him relevant. And relevance became one of the most valuable currencies in modern America. Then came the move that changed his fame forever. Television, The Apprentice. When the show premiered in 2004, Donald Trump was already famous, but television transformed him into something bigger. A character, a symbol, a weekly ritual inside millions of homes. The opening scenes alone looked engineered to reinforce wealth psychology. Private jets, limousines, Manhattan skylines glowing at night, Trump Tower interiors covered in gold and marble, and Donald Trump standing at the center like a corporate emperor. The timing was perfect. America in the early 2000s became obsessed with entrepreneurship and wealth. Reality television blurred entertainment and aspiration. Viewers didn't just watch successful people anymore. They watched competitions for success. The Apprentice turned business into drama, and Donald Trump understood drama better than many Hollywood producers. Every episode reinforced the mythology. He appeared decisive, powerful, demanding, unemotional. Contestants feared disappointing him. The boardroom scenes became theatrical performances of authority, and then came the phrase, "You're fired." Simple, memorable. Television gold. The show exploded internationally. Suddenly, Donald Trump wasn't merely a New York developer anymore. He became one of the most recognizable businessmen on earth. That fame created another extraordinary feedback loop. Television increased his brand value. Brand value increased licensing opportunities. Licensing opportunities increased wealth. Wealth increased media coverage. Media coverage increased fame. The cycle kept feeding itself. Trump hotels appeared across cities. Golf resorts expanded. Merchandise deals multiplied. Books sold millions. And throughout it all, Donald continued mastering one critical skill: controlling narrative momentum. Even when stories became negative, he stayed central to the conversation. That ability separated him from ordinary wealthy individuals. Most billionaires avoid chaos. Trump weaponized attention. He understood modern media rewarded spectacle. Silence created invisibility. Controversy created ratings. And ratings created influence. But long before politics entered the picture, Donald Trump's relationship with fame had already become deeply psychological. He seemed driven not merely by money, but by visibility itself. Buildings mattered because they symbolized dominance. Luxury mattered because it communicated status instantly. Press coverage mattered because it validated importance. Everything connected. Even the interiors of his properties reflected this philosophy. Gold surfaces, massive chandeliers, mirrored walls, grand staircases. The environments projected abundance. Critics called it gaudy. Fans called it aspirational. Either way, people talked about it, and conversation kept the brand alive. Throughout his life, Donald Trump displayed an unusual instinct for understanding emotional reactions to wealth. Most rich people tried to appear tasteful. Trump preferred visible success. He wanted people to know the private jet, the penthouse, the magazine covers, the giant name across skyscrapers. It wasn't subtle. Subtlety wasn't the goal. Power was. And in America's media culture, visibility often became mistaken for power itself. By the late 2000s, Donald Trump existed in a strange category. He was part businessman, part celebrity, part brand, part cultural symbol. His wealth fluctuated constantly depending on markets, debt structures, licensing deals, and valuations, but his fame remained enormous. That distinction mattered, because fame itself became monetizable. Appearances, books, partnerships, television, speaking engagements, real estate branding, even criticism amplified awareness. And through decades of financial turbulence, that awareness protected him repeatedly. There was also another side to the Trump story that fascinated the public: the relentless confidence. Even after failures, even after bankruptcies, even after ridicule, he continued projecting certainty. That fascinated people because most individuals psychologically collapse after public humiliation. Trump seemed energized by conflict. He treated attacks as engagement. Every lawsuit became battle. Every criticism became publicity. Every challenge became performance. This mindset created both admirers and enemies. But emotionally, it made him difficult to ignore. And ignoring Donald Trump may have been the one thing he feared most. People who worked around him often described endless competitiveness. Negotiations stretched for hours. Conversations revolved around winning. Status mattered. Rankings mattered. Media coverage mattered. Even friendships sometimes appeared tied to influence and utility. But supporters viewed these same traits differently. To them, he represented unapologetic ambition, the willingness to think bigger, to negotiate harder, to dominate industries instead of participating quietly. That duality followed him everywhere. Some saw arrogance, others saw confidence, some saw excess, others saw aspiration. The Trump brand thrived precisely because it triggered emotional reactions. Neutrality rarely built empires in media-driven culture. Strong reactions did. And Donald Trump became extraordinarily skilled at manufacturing strong reactions. Even his physical image became part of the brand. The suits, the red ties, the distinctive hair, the speaking style, the hand gestures. Every detail became instantly recognizable. Brand recognition at the highest level. Most corporations spend billions trying to achieve what Trump built around a single personality: recognition, instant association, emotional response. Meanwhile, behind the public spectacle, the mechanics of wealth creation remained deeply rooted in old-school real estate principles learned from Fred Trump. Leverage assets, negotiate aggressively, use debt strategically, seek tax advantages, understand market psychology, and above all, never appear weak during negotiations. Fred Trump built stable wealth quietly. Donald transformed those lessons into high-voltage public capitalism. The father built housing projects. The son built mythology. And mythology proved incredibly profitable. The contrast between them almost feels cinematic. Fred Trump operated like an engineer. Donald operated like a showman. But underneath the spectacle, Donald still relied heavily on the discipline and financial instincts inherited from his father. Even the obsession with winning likely began there. Fred valued toughness. McDonald amplified toughness into identity. As the years passed, Trump properties continued multiplying internationally. Dubai, Panama, Scotland, Las Vegas, Toronto. The brand traveled globally because luxury itself had become globalized, and the Trump name symbolized a very specific version of luxury. Not old aristocratic refinement. Modern visible wealth. Big, shiny, aggressive, confident. For millions of people around the world, the brand represented American capitalism at maximum volume. There were failures too. Many. Business ventures collapsed, projects stalled, legal battles continued. Critics constantly questioned valuations and financial claims. But the remarkable part of Trump's career wasn't the absence of failure. It was survival through failure. Again, and again, and again. Each comeback reinforced the mythology further because audiences love resurrection stories, especially when the protagonist refuses embarrassment. That psychological resilience became one of Trump's greatest business tools. Many executives disappear after financial disasters. Trump attacked forward. He counterpunched publicly. He reframed losses. He projected confidence until confidence itself became strategy. And whether people admired or despised him, they watched. That attention translated into opportunities ordinary businessmen never received. At times, it almost seemed like Donald Trump understood entertainment better than finance. Or maybe he understood that modern finance itself had become entertainment. Stock markets moved emotionally. Brands moved emotionally. Consumers bought emotionally. Investors reacted emotionally. Trump thrived inside emotional economies. He sold aspiration, power, victory, luxury, status, and most importantly, he sold narrative. The narrative of the winner. That narrative of the winner. That narrative persisted even when reality became complicated, because stories often matter more than spreadsheets in public imagination. Look at the architecture of Trump Tower again. The gleaming surfaces, the towering atrium, the dramatic escalators. It doesn't merely communicate wealth, it stages wealth. The building behaves like a movie set for success. That instinct ran through Donald Trump's entire career. Everything became presentation. The entrances, the logos, the interviews, the office decor, the helicopters, the magazine photos, even business announcements carried theatrical energy. He turned capitalism into spectacle, and in doing so, he became one of the most famous businessmen in modern history. But fame carried costs. The more visible he became, the more scrutiny intensified. Journalists investigated his finances constantly. Competitors mocked him. Comedians impersonated him. Tabloids dissected his marriages. Lawsuits followed him for decades. And still somehow, the attention often strengthened the brand rather than weakening it. Because every headline kept him culturally relevant. That may have been Trump's greatest understanding. Relevance creates opportunity. Disappear from public attention long enough, and power fades. Remain central to conversation, and possibilities continue emerging. This instinct became especially obvious during moments when other businessmen would retreat. Trump advanced. When critics attacked him, he escalated. When newspapers predicted collapse, he granted interviews. When financial pressure mounted, he projected larger ambition. Psychologically, it created the image of someone impossible to eliminate. And in competitive industries, perceived invincibility can become extremely valuable. There's another reason his story captivated millions. America has always been fascinated by reinvention. The idea that someone can rise, collapse, and rise again feels deeply embedded in American mythology. Trump embodied that cycle repeatedly. Queens developer, Manhattan star, casino king, debt crisis, television icon, business brand. every phase contained dramatic transitions. Every phase introduced higher stakes, and throughout all of it, Donald Trump maintained extraordinary belief in his own instincts. Sometimes that confidence created success, sometimes disaster, but hesitation rarely defined him. That willingness to move aggressively became central to how he accumulated wealth. Most people fear looking foolish. Trump often appeared immune to that fear. He made gigantic promises publicly. Some succeeded, some failed spectacularly. But the scale itself generated fascination, because ambition at massive scale becomes entertaining, especially in cities like New York. New York rewarded larger-than-life personalities. And during the 1980s and 1990s, Trump became one of the city's ultimate larger-than-life characters. Walk through Manhattan during that era, and his presence felt everywhere. Tabloids at newspaper stands, towering buildings, television screens inside bars, business magazines displayed in lobby waiting rooms. His image blended with the city's identity. To supporters, he represented success. To critics, excess. But almost nobody ignored him, and perhaps that was always the objective. Not merely wealth, influence, cultural dominance, psychological presence. Even today, discussions about Donald Trump often drift beyond business into performance, branding, media strategy, and human psychology. Because his career blurred those worlds together, he understood that modern fame could amplify financial opportunity dramatically. A famous developer attracts more investors. A famous brand licenses easier. A famous personality commands television ratings. A famous name increases property values. Trump leveraged visibility like an asset class, and few businessmen before him operated at that level of media integration. The irony is that much of his empire emerged during periods when traditional elite institutions underestimated him. Many Manhattan elites viewed him as flashy, unsophisticated, too loud, too theatrical. Trump responded by becoming even louder. He didn't attempt to imitate old money restraint. He built a new version of status centered on visibility. That distinction mattered enormously. Old wealth often hides. Trump wealth announced itself. Gold lettering, luxury branding, media appearances, towering architecture. It reflected a changing culture where celebrity increasingly merged with business power. In many ways, Donald Trump arrived at exactly the right historical moment. Cable television expanded. Tabloid culture intensified. Celebrity obsession exploded. Consumer capitalism accelerated. Luxury branding globalized. And Trump instinctively understood how to operate inside all of it. He wasn't simply selling apartments or hotel rooms. He was selling emotional fantasy. The fantasy of winning, of dominance, of visible success, of entering rooms lined with marble and gold where ordinary limitations no longer applied. People bought that fantasy for decades. And even people who rejected it often remained fascinated by it. That fascination became part of the business model itself. Because in media culture, fascination generates traffic. Traffic generates revenue. Revenue generates power. Trump grasped this earlier than many traditional businessmen. And perhaps that explains why his career often resembled entertainment more than conventional corporate leadership. He built suspense around himself. Would the deal happen? Would the casino survive? Would the project collapse? Would the comeback work? The uncertainty kept audiences engaged. Even his negotiating style carried theatrical elements. He exaggerated, applied pressure, created urgency, projected dominance. Sometimes it alienated people. Sometimes it produced leverage. But it always generated momentum. Momentum mattered enormously in Trump's world. If projects kept moving, perception remained alive. and perception influenced financing. The interplay between image and economics became one of the defining themes of his career. By the time younger entrepreneurs began studying branding in the digital age, Trump had already spent decades treating his identity like a global commercial product. The name itself became currency. That achievement did not happen accidentally. It required obsessive self-promotion, relentless media engagement, and an unusual tolerance for controversy. Most executives protect privacy. Trump monetized publicity. Even the architecture of his offices reflected image management. Photographs with celebrities, magazine covers framed on walls, luxury finishes everywhere. Visitors entered spaces designed to communicate success instantly. Again, perception. Always perception. Yet beneath all the branding and spectacle remained a man shaped profoundly by childhood influences. Fred Trump's discipline, competitive schooling, New York aggression, the belief that weakness invited defeat. Donald Trump didn't emerge from comfort. He emerged from pressure. Pressure to succeed. Pressure to dominate. Pressure to exceed expectations. And perhaps most importantly, pressure to become larger than the environment he came from. Queens built him. But Manhattan transformed him. The skyline became both inspiration and scoreboard. Every tower represented conquest. Every acquisition represented status. Every headline represented validation. The city itself almost functioned like an opponent he needed to defeat. And throughout decades of changing economies, media revolutions, and public controversies, Donald Trump remained locked in the same pursuit. Attention, influence, victory. His story cannot be understood purely through balance sheets. It requires understanding spectacle, psychology, narrative, American ambition, the hunger to be seen. Because Donald Trump didn't merely build buildings, he built one of the most recognizable personal brands on earth. And he did it through a combination of relentless ambition, media instinct, aggressive negotiation, strategic self-promotion, enormous risk-taking, and a near-superhuman refusal to disappear. That refusal may be the key to everything. Again and again, moments arrived when critics predicted the end. Financial collapse, business failures, public scandals, debt crises, mockery. And each time, somehow, Donald Trump remained in the center of the frame. Still talking, still negotiating, still building, still branding, still fighting for attention. Like New York itself, he thrived on motion, on noise, on competition. And maybe that's why the opening image of his story feels so powerful. A young man leaving Queens for Manhattan, walking into the capital of ambition with impossible confidence. Surrounded by skyscrapers built by older, richer, more experienced men, and yet believing, completely believing, that one day his own name would tower above the city. Not hidden in fine print, not buried inside corporate structures, but blazing across buildings in giant gold letters, Trump. For better or worse, he accomplished exactly that. And the road from Queens apartment complexes to international fame became one of the most dramatic, controversial, unpredictable rise-to-wealth stories in modern American history. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the story wasn't the buildings, or the billions, or even the fame. It was the mindset, the relentless conviction that reality itself could be negotiated. That image could create opportunity. That confidence could alter outcomes. That attention could become power. Donald Trump spent decades proving, or attempting to prove, those ideas on the largest stage possible. Sometimes brilliantly, sometimes disastrously, but never quietly. And that may ultimately explain why the world kept watching, because quiet people rarely become myths. Donald Trump spent his entire life trying to become one, long before cameras followed him through marble hallways and boardrooms. Donald Trump learned something essential from observing New York itself. The city respected winners, not necessarily the wisest, not necessarily the most ethical, the winners. In Manhattan during the late 20th century, survival required aggression. Bankers fought bankers, developers fought politicians, newspapers hunted scandals because scandals called copies. Every restaurant table inside Midtown steakhouses felt like a negotiation battlefield disguised by expensive wine. Trump absorbed that energy completely. He learned to speak with certainty even when outcomes remained uncertain. He learned that hesitation signaled weakness in high-pressure business environments. Most importantly, he learned that people often followed confidence before evidence. That realization became one of the engines behind his rise. When Donald entered rooms full of executives decades older than him, he compensated for lack of experience with overwhelming certainty. Some found it absurd, others found it persuasive. But almost everyone remembered him, and memory matters in business, especially in industries where opportunity moves through relationships. One of Trump's earliest talents involved making himself impossible to forget. At luxury events throughout Manhattan, he positioned himself carefully. He understood photography angles. He understood newspaper culture. He understood that journalists needed personalities, not spreadsheets. So he became a personality, not spreadsheets. So he became a personality. A businessman who spoke like a celebrity. A celebrity who spoke like a salesman. The line between the two started dissolving around him. Inside Trump Tower during the 1980s, the atmosphere reflected this fusion perfectly. The lobby glowed under polished lighting. Wealthy tourists wandered through marble corridors just to experience the building. Security guards monitored movement while executives rushed toward elevators. Everything felt designed to produce emotional impact. Even people who disliked Trump often admitted the building possessed undeniable theatrical power. And that word mattered, theatrical. Donald Trump understood that wealthy environments could manipulate psychology. If clients felt impressed, negotiations shifted. If reporters felt overwhelmed, stories changed tone. If consumers associated the brand with luxury, prices could rise. Every detail mattered. Every visual cue, every public appearance, every quote. Trump approached wealth not merely as economics, but as emotional architecture. Then came another obsession: casinos. To Donald Trump, Atlantic City represented more than gambling, it represented scale. Casinos operated 24 hours a day. Lights never turned off. Money moved constantly. Celebrities visited. Politicians visited. High rollers arrived carrying fortunes. The environment fit Trump's instincts perfectly. Bigger, louder, more dramatic. When he acquired casino properties, he didn't market them conservatively. He marketed them like spectacles. Commercials flashed with glamour and excess. Billboards dominated highways. Television promotions promised fantasy and excitement. The Taj Mahal especially became symbolic of Trump's philosophy. Why build something respectable when you could build something overwhelming? The casino featured enormous decorative excess because Trump believed people associated grandeur with power, and for a while the strategy appeared unstoppable. Money poured through gaming floors. Tourists arrived by the thousands. Trump's face covered magazines. He purchased a Boeing 727 jet. He bought one of the largest yachts in the world. Luxury surrounded him constantly. To millions watching from outside, Donald Trump looked like the human embodiment of 1980s capitalism. Aggressive, lavish, unapologetic. But underneath the spectacle, pressure intensified. Debt accumulated at terrifying levels. The expansion had become so rapid, so leveraged, that even minor economic changes threatened catastrophe. And catastrophe arrived. The late 1980s and early 1990s hit Trump hard, very hard. Interest payments exploded. Real estate values weakened. Casino revenues struggled. Suddenly, newspapers began publishing numbers that sounded almost unreal. Hundreds of millions owed, then billions. Financial analysts predicted complete destruction. The same media that once celebrated Trump's ambition now treated him like a symbol of reckless greed. Late-night comedians mocked him. Business journalists dissected every failure. The image cracked publicly. For many ambitious personalities, that kind of humiliation becomes psychologically unbearable. But Donald Trump reacted differently. He fought constantly. He negotiated with banks for survival. He persuaded creditors that restructuring served everyone better than liquidation. He sold assets strategically. He adapted. And while privately dealing with enormous financial stress, he maintained the performance of confidence publicly. That contradiction fascinated observers. How could someone under such pressure continue projecting dominance? But perhaps Trump understood something critical. If confidence disappeared, leverage disappeared. So confidence became survival. There were moments during that period when the situation looked almost surreal. One day, tabloids displayed glamorous photographs of Trump attending elite Manhattan events. The next day, financial pages discussed potential collapse, public triumph, private pressure. The duality intensified his mystique. And strangely, the near collapse ultimately deepened his legend. Because audiences remember dramatic recoveries. They remember survival stories. Especially when the survivor refuses shame. Trump never behaved like a defeated man. That psychological resistance became central to his public image. Over time, he transformed financial crises into evidence of resilience. And for many followers, the comebacks mattered more than the failures themselves. Meanwhile, America changed. Television accelerated. Celebrity culture expanded aggressively during the 1990s. Business leaders increasingly became entertainment figures, and Trump fit the new media environment almost perfectly. He spoke in headlines, quick, punchy, memorable. Television producers loved guests who generated energy instantly. Trump generated energy instantly. He entered interviews like a boxer entering a ring, confident, combative, prepared to dominate attention. Even critics unintentionally strengthened his visibility by discussing him constantly. That pattern repeated throughout his entire career. Opposition often increased exposure. Exposure increased relevance. Relevance increased commercial value. It was an unusual business ecosystem built partly on conflict itself. Then, in the early 2000s, The Apprentice elevated everything. The show didn't merely revive Trump's image. It redefined him for an entirely new generation. Viewers suddenly encountered Donald Trump not as a struggling casino operator from old newspaper scandals, but as the ultimate corporate authority figure. The production carefully reinforced that narrative. Camera shots lingered on Manhattan skylines. Music swelled dramatically. Contestants waited nervously outside polished boardrooms. Trump entered scenes slowly, surrounded by executives. The visual language communicated one message repeatedly: power. Every episode strengthened the mythology. Contestants competed desperately for approval. Trump evaluated them with icy confidence. Viewers watched ambition become entertainment. And at the center of it stood Donald Trump, once again transformed into a symbol larger than ordinary business reality. The genius of the show involved emotional aspiration. Millions of viewers imagined themselves inside that world. Luxury hotels, corporate competition, high-stakes decisions, private jets. Trump became associated not merely with wealth, but with the fantasy of upward mobility. and television amplified the emotional impact enormously. By then, Trump had spent decades mastering visual identity. The boardroom itself looked carefully curated. Dark wood, expensive lighting, massive windows overlooking New York. The environments reinforced authority psychologically. Everything surrounding Trump communicated success. Whether viewers consciously recognized it or not, the branding operated constantly. The catchphrase, "You're fired," exploded into global popular culture. Suddenly, Trump's personality reached audiences far beyond real estate or finance. Children recognized him, international audiences recognized him, people who had never visited New York recognized him. Fame expanded exponentially, and with fame came more business opportunities. Licensing deals accelerated. Developers across the world wanted the Trump name attached to projects because the name itself carried market value. That represented one of the most significant transformations in Trump's wealth strategy. Instead of relying purely on ownership, he increasingly monetized identity. The brand became scalable. Hotels carrying the Trump name could emerge internationally without requiring direct ownership of every property. It was a modern approach to wealth generation rooted in perception and recognition. Again, the name itself became the product, and few individuals in modern business history have monetized personal branding more aggressively. At the same time, critics argued that much of the Trump phenomenon depended heavily on image management, but Trump himself would likely consider that observation obvious. Image management was never accidental. It was strategy. In luxury industries especially, perception influences value constantly. A famous brand can charge higher prices. A famous building attracts buyers. A famous developer receives media attention competitors cannot purchase. Trump exploited these realities relentlessly. Even his social interactions often reflected transactional awareness. He networked constantly. Celebrities, athletes, executives, media personalities. The social world surrounding wealth became another arena for visibility. Appear at the right event, stand beside the right people, generate the right photographs. Again and again, Trump transformed public attention into economic leverage. And while critics frequently dismissed him as excessive, excess itself became central to the brand. People expected extravagance, gold interiors, massive penthouses, luxury everything. Trump rarely attempted minimalism because minimalism didn't produce emotional spectacle. Spectacle produced headlines. The branding strategy extended even into his speaking patterns. He used repetition, simple language, bold declarations, short memorable phrases, communication designed for media circulation. In television culture, complicated explanations often disappear. Simple dramatic statements spread rapidly. Trump understood this intuitively. And whether in business interviews, reality television, or public appearances, he repeatedly used language designed for maximum retention. But behind the confidence remained a deeper psychological drive: recognition, winning publicly, validation at enormous scale. Many people who worked around Trump noticed how intensely he monitored coverage and rankings. Lists mattered. Valuations mattered. Reputation mattered. Competition remained constant. That intensity likely connected back to childhood dynamics with Fred Trump. Fred built success through discipline and relentless focus. Donald inherited the hunger, but transformed it into performance. Where Fred operated regionally, Donald sought global visibility. Where Fred emphasized steady profitability, Donald pursued symbolic dominance. The sun expanded the game, and the stakes became enormous. Throughout decades of business activity, one pattern appeared repeatedly. Trump rarely thought small. Even when logic suggested caution, he preferred expansion. Bigger towers, more visible branding, larger statements, greater attention. Sometimes the strategy generated extraordinary rewards, sometimes crushing financial pressure. But moderation never defined him. That made him compelling to audiences. People rarely become fascinated by cautious personalities. They become fascinated by risk-takers, especially risk-takers who survive spectacularly. And Trump repeatedly survived moments that appeared career-ending. That survival created an aura around him. To supporters, he became proof that aggressive ambition could overcome collapse. To critics, he became proof that fame itself could shield people from consequences. Either way, the fascination endured. Even the geography of Trump's story feels cinematic. Queens, Brooklyn construction sites, Midtown Manhattan towers, Atlantic City casinos glowing through the night, private jets crossing skylines, television studios, luxury penthouses overlooking Central Park. Every setting reinforced the larger-than-life atmosphere surrounding his rise. And through all those environments moved the same central figure. Confident, combative, obsessed with winning, obsessed with visibility, obsessed with scale. Donald Trump didn't merely pursue wealth, he pursued symbolic wealth, the kind people could see instantly. Because visible success created psychological impact, he understood that better than many financiers who quietly accumulated larger fortunes without public recognition. Trump preferred recognition. Recognition amplified influence, and influence generated opportunities beyond traditional business. Over decades, his career evolved into something difficult to categorize cleanly. He was a developer, a marketer, a media personality, a negotiator, a celebrity, a businessman operating partly inside entertainment. That hybrid identity allowed him to survive in ways traditional executives often could not. If one sector weakened, visibility from another sector maintained relevance. Real estate struggled. Television expanded his fame. Business criticism intensified. Media exposure kept the brand alive. The ecosystem surrounding Trump became unusually resilient because it operated across multiple industries simultaneously, and beneath it all remained one constant principle: attention equals leverage. That principle shaped nearly every major decision in his career. It explains the branding, the interviews, the architecture, the television appearances, the dramatic statements, the public feuds. Trump recognized that in modern culture, visibility itself could become economic infrastructure. The more people talked about him, the more opportunities emerged. Some businessmen hide from publicity to protect privacy. Trump treated publicity like oxygen. Even the controversies often reinforced his centrality in public conversation, and centrality mattered enormously to him. Because once audiences stop paying attention, mythology fades. Donald Trump spent decades ensuring the spotlight remained fixed on him, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes chaotically, but almost always successfully. In the end, his rise from Queens developer to internationally famous billionaire cannot be explained through real estate alone. Thousands of developers made money. Very few transformed themselves into global symbols. Trump did, by combining business ambition with celebrity instincts, by turning confidence into branding, by treating architecture like theater, by understanding media psychology before most traditional businessmen recognized its power, and by refusing, almost pathologically refusing, to disappear after failure. That relentless refusal became part of the legend. Every comeback strengthened the narrative. Every headline expanded recognition. Every skyscraper carrying his name reinforced the mythology further. A young man arrived in Manhattan believing he could place his name above the skyline. Most people would consider that fantasy delusional. Donald Trump treated it like destiny. And whether admired or criticized, celebrated or condemned, he spent the next several decades bending enormous parts of American media and business culture around that belief. The ambition never truly slowed. The hunger for visibility never truly disappeared. The instinct for spectacle remained constant. Even after decades of fame, Trump still seemed driven by the same emotional engine that pushed him toward Manhattan in the beginning. The need to win publicly, to dominate attention, to stand taller than competitors, to transform his own identity into something unforgettable. And perhaps that's the ultimate reason his story became so culturally powerful. Because beneath the gold branding, the casinos, the television cameras, the skyscrapers, and the controversies lies something intensely human. The desire to matter, to be seen, to leave a mark large enough that the world cannot ignore it. Donald Trump pursued that desire with extraordinary aggression, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes recklessly, but always dramatically. And drama, more than almost anything else, kept audiences watching him for decades, watching the rise, watching the collapse, watching the comeback, watching the performance continue. The city that first inspired him, loud, competitive, ruthless Manhattan, never really left him. Its energy became embedded inside his personality. Move fast, think bigger, fight harder, never admit weakness, never disappear. For Donald Trump, those weren't merely business tactics. They became identity. And that identity transformed a developer from Queens into one of the most recognizable and controversial wealth figures in modern history.